And long time no see.
It's been a while. Good to see you.
Hello, everyone.
Hey.
I'll turn my camera on here and we'll see how.
There we go.
We move the change. You hear what I'm saying? Real players can relate, cause they the ones that was playing. Be great, just wait. We be really in the field. Now we really on the mic, speaking truly how we feel. For real, screaming hut one, hut two. Tell me what.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Move the Chains. I'm your guest host, Matt Baker with BCLions.com. Ryan Phillips today, unfortunately busy, but for good reasons. We got some good news in the CFL this week. We're going to camp July 10th, mark it down. So RP and the coaches and the players, they're getting ready, doing playbooks, doing install, all that stuff. But we'll keep moving those chains. And this is a very important topic. Every episode we've done on this podcast is important, but this one hits a little bit closer to home. We're in June, which is National Indigenous History Month in Canada. June 21st, Monday, is National Indigenous Peoples Day. And with everything going on in the news, we really wanted to have a raw and real conversation about Indigenous issues in Canada and all across North America. It's not just a BC story. Everyone has seen the very sad news, the horrific discovery of 215 unmarked graves at a residential school in Kamloops. Reports of up to 104 more in Manitoba, 35 in Lestock, Saskatchewan, and sadly, the list just keeps going on. The number could reach up to 4,000 that we know of. And we have two very special guests today where this topic really hits close to home. David Pratt is the second vice chief at Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, works closely with many communities across Canada and the U.S., as well as with government institutions focusing on truth and reconciliation, mental health programs, and suicide prevention, to name just a few things. Our other guest, definitely familiar to you great BC Lions fans, is J.R. Larose, a former Lion, 2011 Grey Cup champ, also played with Edmonton and had a decade-long career in the Canadian Football League and is still a very active part of our community with Be More Than a Bystander, very important. JR, also a member of the Cree Nation, and is registered to the One Arrow First Nation in Saskatchewan. Gentlemen, thanks for doing this today.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Start with you, David. I know you're really deep into the re-election plans and stuff right now, and we appreciate you making the time. While Canada and the entire world is in shock at these unmarked graves, sadly, it's not something new to you, is it?
No, it isn't. No, it's. I think there's. I think first of all, I want to acknowledge you today for having me on the podcast, and I want to acknowledge the team and as well as the organization, as all the players, including the alumni that we're all proud of. Of course, J.R. Larose, we're all very proud of him. Saskatchewan boy, registered to One Arrow First Nation here in Treaty 6. So we're very happy and proud of his accomplishments. But I want to recognize you and your fans and your organization. And I think we share the same happiness that the CFL season is a go. We're looking forward to the season starting and getting back. Of course, Saskatchewan, we're all Riders fans here, so I'll be cheering for the Riders, but I acknowledge the Lions today. But I just wanted to say that you can see the green and white of the Meadow Lake Tribal Council there. So we're just happy to be here today. But yeah, we're very familiar with the stories. We're very familiar with a lot of the experiences of our families. My parents both went to residential school. My older siblings went to residential school. My uncles and aunts, and of course my grandparents on both sides were part of that system. So very familiar with all the history and some of the stories that have come out, and now it's coming to light again. So we're all very reminded, I guess, of the terrible history of the residential school system. And the discovery in Kamloops, I think, has just reopened a lot of the hurts and the wounds of the past. And I think a lot of people are hurting right now, and not just Indigenous people. I think non-Indigenous people too, as well, are shocked and horrified at the discovery in Kamloops. And I think as we do more of the ground radar searches, there'll be more numbers added to that. And we're going to have to be prepared probably over the next few years for us to be able to deal with the impacts of these discoveries.
Yeah, David, you can remind the folks in Saskatchewan we're coming August 6th. That's going to be marvelous 33,000 fans in Regina, but I might have to do a friendly wager another time. But
Yeah.
and you can't take the green out of Saskatchewan fans, I know, but good for you for staying true. JR, again, this is a serious discussion, but you have to have some levity in your day. JR, what about your experience? I understand your mother Barbara went to a residential school.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that really, really hits home for me. We talk about the personal stories. My mom was taken from her community, at a young age, placed in the nearest town, Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, where the residential school was. And you talk about the horrific things that had happened. My mom was left-handed, got hit with a strap, was forced to use her right hand. My mom spoke her Cree language fluently, was slapped in the mouth every time she spoke her Cree language, forced to speak English, had a medical condition, where she wasn't able to control her bladder. Ended up, what the nuns would do is, they placed my mom in the middle of the room, placed the sheet over her head that, she had peed on, to made an example of in front of all, the little girls. And, time and time again, you hear the horrific stories that have happened. And it's something that impacted me. Growing up, my mother ended up turning to addictions, to numb that pain. She didn't know who she could talk to or who she could trust. When she was done with it, and it had an impact on me, growing up. So we talk about this, this is something that really hits home, and I'm honored to be a part of this. I'm honored that, the organization that I played for 5 years, very proud to play with BC winning Grey Cup is doing this, raising awareness on this. And for me, this is how I honor my mom's story as well. So thank you for this.
Wow, just unbelievable to hear some of these stories that are still coming through. The Canadian government, gentlemen, has come out and said that it's part of the sad history of the country. And I think, David, you kind of alluded to it at the start, that it's still ongoing. This isn't necessarily history, is it, because of that? What is some of more of the lasting impact of the trauma of these schools, David?
Well, first of all, thank you for answering that question. I think what we're dealing with right now, and I was talking to some of our chiefs and our leadership, as well as our elders, of course, since the discovery, and including my own family, and it's impacting every age group, especially those that survived and actually attended the residential schools. It's almost like their wounds have been reopened again. I talked to an individual here who attended, and she said it was almost like she was back in the residential school 5 years old again and experiencing everything that she went through. It just took her right back since the discovery. And a lot of our young people who didn't even attend residential school are still, there's a lot of anger, of course, at discovery, as well as a lot of other emotions that are coming to the top. And I think this goes to show that it's not something that happened, so many years ago. We got to remember that the last residential school closed in 1996. That's only about 25 years ago. That was the last residential school that was in operation. It was in Saskatchewan. I believe it was the George Gordon Indian Residential School, run by the Anglican Church, I believe. A lot of atrocities and a lot of terrible things took place at that school in terms of physical and sexual abuse. And I think that in terms of those intergenerational impacts, they're still being felt today. I talked to one of our chiefs just yesterday and sensed her frustration. A very productive chief, worked very hard for community, building it up, housing, infrastructure, programs for the kids, all kinds of stuff. And it's almost like she was literally at the breaking point. And this is a very strong individual that's been in leadership for a number of years, maintains a drug and alcohol-free lifestyle into her culture and ceremony. And one of the things that she talked about was we've really got to address the trauma amongst our people. And I think that's when we see our people dealing with addictions, when we see our people dealing with alcohol or drugs or sex or types of behavior that are self-harming, a lot of that has to do with the underlying trauma that either their grandparents experienced, their parents experienced, that is still impacting them. And we're going to have some hard discussions and we have a lot of truth that needs to come out. And I think that is a part of truth and reconciliation. The truth has to come out. And as a part of reconciliation, Canada has a responsibility to own up and accept its part of its role, as well as the church. One of the issues right now is we're having challenges getting the Catholic Church to recognize their role. The Anglican Church has released an apology. We'd like to see the Catholic Church do the same. plus follow through on their commitments. When the apology was issued, they committed to a $27 million healing fund to help deal with some of the trauma. So there'll be a lot of stuff that has to happen. And we're thankful for some of the Western-based stuff on mental health and therapy, and all of that is good. But I really think we have to focus on our own spirituality as Indigenous people, our own culture, our own ceremonies, and our own holistic ways of healing and being connected to our ceremonies to the earth as well as to our Creator. And I think that's going to go a long way to heal some of these lasting harms and impacts of the residential school legacy, which we're still dealing with today. It's unacceptable. You're familiar with the high rates of incarceration rates, the high rates of poverty, the lower lifespan, the higher rates of HIV, hepatitis C. I mean, we've still got Northern First Nations communities that are still dealing with tuberculosis. And that's pretty much a disease that's been eradicated in many parts of the world, in the West, in the G7, but we're still dealing with it in northern, remote, isolated communities, not only in Saskatchewan, but in other parts of the north across this country. So it just shows the amount of work that we have to do. We're pleased with Canada's $18 billion recent announcement for investments, where we know that that's a start, but there has to be a major investment to deal with some of the lasting impacts of the trauma of the residential school and some of those ripple effects that are still being felt by today's generation, including myself.
Yeah, no doubt the impact of this will still be felt for a long time. Nobody can bring the kids back or take away that trauma you're talking about. But you talked about the church, a little bit about the other financial situations. What else can be done by the Canadian government or by regular folks like us and those watching this podcast? JR?
I think what can be done is continuing holding a space for people to share their stories, speak their truth, and be heard. Like Vice Chief David had alluded to, and said that there's a lot of trauma that has taken place, and our people need help. That's the only way we truly are able to move forward. If there's no resources, we continue to hurt. And I don't know if you want to touch on that anymore, Vice Chief, but it's there's a lot of hurt people out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, definitely, JR. I totally agree with you. Is that a part of that intergenerational trauma? It still has its lasting impacts right now. You got to remember that when the children were taken away, it was under the RCMP was right there. So the RCMP had a role to play in this, as well as the church. When they would show up at the First Nation, all the children would be loaded into the back of the truck, and the police would go from home to home with the priests and nuns, and take the children right out of the arms of the parents and grandparents. Now, some of our people were lucky they didn't go because the parents and grandparents hid them. And some of them were in isolated areas. They took them into the bush and the trap line in the cabins. And those people, fortunately, were able to not escape the horrors that we went through. My mother, Jared talked about his mother's story. My mother was 8 years old and taken to the residential school in Bertel, Manitoba. And she was only 8 years old. And I remember her sharing the story with us, and it was very difficult for her to share it. And she was only 8, and she was caught. My mother was a fluent Soto Cree speaker, and she could speak fluent Soto. She got caught speaking Soto in Bertel. So what the nuns did to her was that they made her hold her arms out like this. And then they took this big, long strap like a tire tread. There were little metal pieces sticking out of it. And they strapped her from the tips of her fingers to her elbows for speaking Soto. She said her hands were so swollen, she couldn't close her fingers. And she had cut marks from the tip of her fingers right up to her elbow. And that's just an example of her story. Of course, there were other terrible things that happened to her. And when my mother went for her residential school adjudication, she didn't talk about a lot of the stuff that she went through. It was a very difficult thing for her to open up in terms of some of the other sexual abuse that she experienced at the hands of the priests and nuns. And she just wanted the whole process to be over with. And for them, it wasn't about money. It was about the state's recognition and the role that they played in harming our children and our family structures here as Indigenous people, and enforcing that policy of assimilation based on the white supremacy and the doctrine of discovery by the Catholic Church. So all of those things are still being felt today. So we got a long ways to go. But I think if all of us can recognize that it happened, if we can accept that it happened, if we can work together to find solutions collectively, I think we're going to be able to move forward on this. And like you said earlier, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time, but I think that we give it some time, a generation or two, we'll be able to recover. That we'll be back to where we originally were, a strong, thriving, independent First Nations people of this land, the way it was prior to contact.
Yeah, listening to you guys give your personal accounts is just enough to, make your skin crawl. And then this is just two examples here. So, there's millions more. Here's something I've thought about, excuse me, quite a bit in the last couple weeks. As someone who graduated high school in the early part of the century, we, of course, learned about World War II, excuse me, World War II, the Holocaust, took some Canadian history courses in college. And of course, you learn about, the Chinese discrimination, the railroad. I have some Japanese relatives whose ancestors were part of the internment camps post-World War II in various small towns across Canada. I don't recall learning anything close in the high school curriculum or whatever to what we're hearing now. Why do you think that is, JR?
Again, not taking ownership of what happened. I think that's why it's not being learned. There needs to be acknowledgement, which I think there is now. But that's the only way we talk about moving forward is having people learn. We talk about this is part of the history. This is what happened. This is almost seen as genocide. It's happened here in Canada. And that needs to be talked about, needs to be learned about, so people can now understand, I think, some of the issues, the traumas that Indigenous people are faced with. And it just doesn't end with residential school survivors. It's intergenerational, the impacts. It had a long-lasting impact on their kids and their kids' kids, but it needs to be taught in school.
Yeah.
And you talk about those generations. How can these younger generations escape this trauma? I mean, any programs, more education, Indigenous mentorship? Vice Chief, what do you think? What can be done in that regard to help these younger folks who may have?
I think that's a good question. And I think right now what we're seeing is a lot of our younger people are embracing good, positive pathways. You have those that are excelling in sports. Ethan Bear, prime example from Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 territory, Ochapowace Cree Nation, near Broadview, Whitewood. We're all very proud of him. Bridget Lequette from Cody, as well as I believe Duck. I can't remember. Mallard, First Nation in Manitoba. Her dad's from Mallard and her mother's from Cody in Saskatchewan. So I think those two young people are prime examples of young people that are excelling in sports. But there's a number of other cases, and I think we need I think our youth need to be inspired, and our youth need to. There's something wrong with and here from Saskatchewan, I'm in the north right now. When a 10-year-old girl will take her own life, when 10-year and 12-year-olds are committing suicide, which is happening in northern Saskatchewan, over the course of the past few years, what causes a baby to lose hope? When you're 10 and 12 years old, that's when you should be dreaming. That's when you should be pretending to be a nurse or an astronaut or a scientist or a doctor, or you're a kid. You should be your dreams should be high. But what causes these babies to lose hope, that they take their own life? What's happening in their lives that's so terrible and so bad that they'd rather end their life at that age than to live a full life and go on and to be a part of the Canadian experience and to live a good healthy life. So we have discussions, and I think promoting those young people that are engaging in business and being successful as nursing and the trades and industry, I think that's a part of it. But I think it also is where our generation and even older, we have a role and responsibility to play too as well. And recognizing our own choices and our own trauma in our own lives and finding healing, and then speaking to the younger people and encouraging them to make better choices so that they're not following the same pathway that many of us have done in the past, including myself. And I think that as we have those discussions and as we talk about those issues, I think, and bring them to light, I think we're going to see a lot of healing take place. and we're gonna be able to have open, honest discussions on a number of issues that are affecting our people, and even especially our young people.
And just even to touch on that, Vice Chief, we see a lot of young role models. You listed off too, and we look at guys like Linklater. The list could go on of positive male role models. And I think the shift is what's happening with this generation is they're refusing to allow their situation to become their excuse now.
Yeah.
We're not going to have that victim mentality anymore, and that's what we need to do. Yeah, we acknowledge what happened, the trauma, the pain that's been caused, but it's not. How do we break that cycle? How do we now become, like you said, role models? There needs to be continued support in even funding for athletes to go play these high levels. If it's academy hockey or it's a traveling football team, whatever it is, whatever that sport is, we need funding for. That's one of the main issues.
Yes.
People think, the government gives all this money, this and this. Bunch of BS.
Yeah.
Bunch of BS. There needs to be more funding that supports, Indigenous athletes, Indigenous artists for school. And people think, you get all this money, you're getting a free education. No, it's crap. It's a bunch of crap. Stuff doesn't happen like that anymore. Like they think we just get a bunch of handouts, but we need support. We're asking for support.
Yeah. What people don't realize is that it's a lot of issues with the funding, especially on post-secondary. Each First Nation is only allocated a certain amount of post-secondary dollars based upon their total population, but then only maybe 25 students can get funded, and you got a wait list that's probably 50 more. So we don't receive unlimited education, even though we have a treaty right to education. Housing is another issue, and the list goes on in terms of area where we're underfunded. And JR is right. Like, I think sports is key to helping our kids succeed. It builds teamwork. It builds all these good skills in their life. They learn how to work with others. They learn how to work towards goals. And I'm here right now in Buffalo River Dene Nation in the north with Chief Elmer Camel right now at his home. I'm using his veranda, but they had a championship wrestling program here where they won the gold medals in the provincial, but you never hear about that. But sharing his story with us, he talked about how it brought the parents together with the children, and then even the non-Indigenous parents. So I think sports is key, but we need the funding and the programming. And right now, a lot of our First Nations don't have their own source revenue to be able to provide hockey and baseball and football. We have awesome athletes, championship athletes, natural-born athletes. But unfortunately, the programs, the resources aren't there to be able to fund those programs, get them off the ground, and get these kids building skills and opportunities so that they could get offered scholarships. Sometimes these kids get offered scholarships and they don't even look at their marks. The scouts just see them and their natural talent and ability. And sometimes, unfortunately, our young people don't take advantage of those opportunities when they come. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen. But I think if we can focus on sports, if we could focus on creating those opportunities for our kids, I think that's going to go a long way to bringing the healing of a lot of these issues right now that are taking place. Don Thompson was the wrestling coach that took them to championship here. Chief Campbell's here just with me right now. I'm sitting on his home right now. But these are just some of the examples of our prime sports. And of course, JR right there. Look at his own life and all the challenges he's been through. But in spite of all that, he's got a Grey Cup ring. How many people can say they got a Grey Cup ring? Probably less than 1,000 people in the whole country. But he's got one. Bridget Laquette, a silver medal from the Olympics. Ethan, we're hoping for a cup one day. Fortunately, it wasn't their year this year. But there's prime examples of our young people achieving great things. We just need the resourcing. And it takes a lot of education to stop a lot of these negative stereotypes. So that needs to be part of the conversation too, is further education on taxation and all kinds of other issues. And for the record, Don Thompson was a former Saskatchewan Rough Rider, JR. And he was actually a stand-in for George Reed, but George Reed never got injured, so he never got much playtime.
That's awesome.
Never fails. Every time you go to a Saskatchewan game, it never fails. You see one or two guys with a George Reed jersey. Never fails. Listen, gentlemen, we've covered a lot of great ground here. Truthfully, we could talk for hours, and
Yes.
we've covered a lot of great topics. But before we get out of here, is there anything else either of you want to add? Perhaps truth and reconciliation has been brought up a couple times here. Maybe even before we go, talk about what you mean, what more of a meaning to that. What is meant by that for those who might not be as familiar, just learning more about this stuff?
Go ahead, Jer. I'll let you go first, and then I'll finish off.
Well, the Truth and Reconciliation was created to have people's truth stories heard, believed, and that goes to the educating other people about what happened here in Canada, all the way up until, well, you just said 1996 was the last residential school when the last one was closed. So I think people's stories need to be heard so we can have an understanding, because this isn't being taught in the schools. People need to understand what happened here in Canada. You know, we look at over 400 graves, or 300 or 400. You know, just recently, the 215 that were discovered in Kamloops, out in Kamloops. You know, this is a huge part of what has happened here. A very unfortunate thing that's happened in Canada. That's, you know, their ownership needs to be taken, but education as well, so people can understand what Indigenous people, you know, have had to overcome.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Jerry, yes, and thank you for those comments. I think the latest number is 535 now, the bodies they've discovered. It's going to climb higher.
Yeah.
There's going to be more discoveries as we go on, and yes, it's a prime example of genocide. When you have 215 babies and one of them as young as 3 years old, found in a mass grave, that's something that we have to discuss, and I think we need to move forward. We have to have we have to have those difficult conversations. And you as human beings, you know that sometimes in a relationship, you got to have some honesty, and you got to put everything on the table and have a good, honest discussion about everything. And I think that's what we're going to have here over the course of these next few years. And that as the discoveries pile up, and as more bodies are found, and we know there's going to be more bodies that are found. Justice Sinclair said we need to brace ourselves because the number is going to climb higher. But I think we just need to be able to be aware of the history and accept that history. And Canada, you know, not being afraid or ashamed to talk about it, to own up to what happened in the past, but also to recognize that it can never happen again, and that we move forward together. And education is a key part of that. And the challenges we face here in Saskatchewan with institutional systemic racism from every level of government and all of our institutions against Indigenous people, I think education has a lot to do with that. If we can counter some of the negative stereotypes, number one, we don't pay taxes. Hey, we all pay taxes. When I go to that gas pump, unless that gas station's on a First Nation, I pay taxes. If I'm at the grocery store and I buy a bottle of Aqua de Gio, my favorite cologne, I pay sales tax on that. Education and health tax to help with education and health. Even though I'm a treaty person and the Crown said your education and health will never be lacking, I'm still paying a tax towards that for the region. So we have to counter some stuff. We've got to talk about the issues in housing. We don't get free housing. That's a treaty obligation. We agreed to share with your ancestors. And part of that sharing was that we'd have access to resources and be able to conduct and live our lives as we always have. Unfortunately, Canada has to accept responsibility. Well, before the ink was even dry on the treaty documents, they were already drafting the Indian Act to control every aspect of our lives. So we have to have a good, honest discussion. More education needs to be done, more anti-racism, more culture responsive training, and a greater understanding. And I think we need a law that if it's against the law to deny the Holocaust, like Vert Zundel, that gentleman from Alberta, I don't even like mentioning his name, that denied the Holocaust and faced charges, then there needs to be consequences for people that deny the stories of the residential schools, because already the stories are coming out trying to counter what's being said. So we have to have those honest conversations, education, counter the negative stereotypes, promote our young people. There's just a list of things that we have to get done, but I'm confident we can do it. We've done it in the past. Indigenous people have shown tremendous resiliency, and I think we can do it again, and we can create a better future for the little ones that aren't even born yet, that'll be coming into this world than we've experienced, and especially our parents and grandparents.
A little food for thought. You know, Matt, you've been to 3 schools, you know, growing up from, you know, elementary, primary to middle to high school. Any one of those have a gravesite? No. We look at now the residential schools. How great, just thinking about that, you know, as a parent, that these schools now have grave sites. at the residential schools. When we're in the city, there's not one school that has a grade site attached to it.
Yeah.
Food for thought.
JR, if I could point to that. And it came out here, one story, some letters came out from one of the bishops, that the death rate of the school was 50%. That means one out of every 2 kids that went into that school died. Why was that? We were hearing from our survivors, they were starved. We're hearing from our survivors, they were beaten. They went hungry, all kinds of things. Those children were now malnourished. A lot of them died of disease, but I think a lot of them died of broken hearts and neglect and malnutrition. And we got to keep those stories alive, and we got to make sure that it never, ever happens again. Just like the Jewish people faced the Holocaust in Germany, and they want to ensure that never happened again. We want to do the same thing amongst our Indigenous people, that we never, ever allow our children to go through this ever again. And I think part of that too is also dismantling the child welfare system, which we're working on right now, because that's another system that's just inflicting just as much trauma, in fact, more trauma on Indigenous people here today. And I want to see that system completely torn down, and our children back home with their families, and our people having healthy lives. So thank you.
Thank you both. Hopefully conversation like this is a positive step. By no means are we out of the woods yet here, and we'll call on you guys again. I know, like I said, there's a lot of ground we can cover here, and I appreciate you both for making the time on such an important topic on Move the Chains. JR Larose and Vice Chief David Pratt. I know you guys are both busy with your various positions, and we very much appreciate the time. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Stay safe, everybody.
Take care.
We'll see you August 6th. We'll see you August 6th, guys.
August 6th, of course.
Take
All
care.
right. See you later.
Impact. What up, RP? Let's turn it up one time. You did. We move the chains. You hear what I'm saying? Real players can relate, cause they the ones that was playing. Be great. Just wait. We be really in the field. Now we really on the mic, speaking truly how we feel. For real, screaming hut 1, hut 2. Tell me what you gon' do. Coming off that edge, only way to stop is hold you. Never let the gatekeepers control you. Once you lose your voice, now they definitely know they own you. But not I. Rod Phillips coming so fly. Pick 6 on the way. When that ball's in the sky, they say time is money, and I wonder why. Now I know that's a goddamn lie. Let's go. Come and get game from the chains. Everybody love it when you move the chains. Haters hate to see me really do my thing. Move the chains, move the chains. Let's go. Move the chains. The #1 podcast. Move the chains. Do my thing. Getting this dough, you know how it go. Grab a seat and tune in, then tell me what you know. Back when TIP said get it on the flow, RP was on BC putting on a show. For show, screaming touchdown, touchdown. Everything you want now. Fans be the chain gang, game every month now. Don't even try to front now. These new dudes be something like my son now. Come on now. I'm better than ever. The game that we speak gotta be clever. Ball hard no matter the weather. I cheese for the picks while I'm counting this cheddar. On my mama, boy, I never would let her. But so you know I gotta get up and run just to come and get game from the chains. Everybody love it when you move the chains. Haters hate to see me really do my thing. Move the chains, move the chains. Let's go. Move the chains. The #1 podcast. Move the chains, do my thing. Come and get game from the chains. Everybody love it when you move the chains. Haters hate to see me really do my thing. Move the chains, move the chains. Let's go. Move the chains. The #1 podcast. Move the chains, do my thing.